Hi everyone, my name is Melissa Heikkilä and I'm a senior reporter for AI at MIT Tech Review. Today I'm joined by an all-star cast to talk about a contentious element of the EU's upcoming AI regulation called the AI Act. Now, the AI Act is supposed to mitigate AI harms, but today we're going to be talking about general purpose AI. Now, what we mean by these are, you've probably seen them all around social media. They're really impressive AI systems, such as text generator GPT-3 or text image AI Stable Diffusion or DALL-E. They've been all the rage this year, and the EU wants to regulate them, as the EU does. These systems can be used for disinformation or really, really interesting art. On the panel with me today is Irene Suleiman, who is a policy director of AI startup Hugging Face, Mozilla's own senior policy researcher Max Gantz, and Kim van Sparentak, who is part of the European Parliament's AI Act negotiating team and member of the Green Group. Please do remember to send in your questions in the end, and I'll take as many as I can. Now, Kim, I'd like to start with you. You're in the midst of some intense negotiations in Brussels around the AI Act. Can you tell us, what does the AI Act say now about general purpose AI, and what is the Parliament thinking about it? What is happening in Brussels?
Well, thank you so much for the invitation and also for this question. And I think right now on general purpose AI, to talk about that, we maybe have to take a little step back. Because if you look at the way the AI Act is written, it is built on a product safety model. And normally, when you're talking about product safety, we say a product must be safe, and they must be safe within their reasonably foreseeable use or misuse. This means that if you make a crayon that is be used by kids, you should always assume that this kid will put it in its mouth, although that's not the intended purpose of the crayon. Now, in the AI Act, the Commission didn't put this part forward. They have simply forgotten the fact that, sometimes things can be used in a different way than the intended purpose, and they put that in as the standard. And when we're talking about, general purpose AI, that's actually AI that has multiple purposes. So when we are talking about, current discussions and this general purpose AI, I think when we're talking about the exemption, I think the answer is a clear no. It's a very clear big tech frame, and there's the frame that if these AI systems can be used for different purposes, then we cannot have one single intended purpose. So then it can't be part of the regulation. But these systems usually, to me, have a very clear purpose. The examples you gave: image recognition, text generation. And it's so really simple to see whether such systems could reasonably foreseeably be used or misused for one of the specific high risks. And second of all, even if we would go along with the frame, any AI that can be used for so many things, we really cannot possibly know its impacts and risks. And that's why we should actually be extra safe. And then we should, make sure that they definitely meet all the requirements. So for me, it's a clear no. It shouldn't be exempted from obligations. When we're talking about where we are at in the Parliament, the discussion is still going on. However, you do see that the full exemption, which was like basically what the big tech companies came up with, that is a bit off the table now. It's more like, is there a way to create a definition of general purpose AI, which is kind of gonna be very hard in a legal way, and we're really still, discussing what we would do specifically for general purpose AI.
Thank you. Now, Max, earlier you said that this has become a make or break issue in the debate. Can you tell me why is it so, and why is it so important that you gets this right?
Hi, and thank you for the question. I think there's a bunch of different reasons for this, but maybe to sort of like start with the why we need to address this is that I think these models are very, very impressive with the things they can do, and the progress we've seen in the past years and also the past months, but they're also very far from flawless. and still come with a lot of risks. For example, I'm sure a lot of people in the audience are familiar with the issue of harmful biases in AI. And my colleagues at Mozilla have made an entire podcast series that addresses a lot of the sort of like circumstances in which bias can cause harm in AI, for example, in healthcare. But with these general purpose AI models, the issue is also that these are trained on data sets that are essentially scraped from all corners of the internet, with all the harmful stereotypes against women and Black people and religious groups that you see on the internet subsequently being encoded in these models. And then these models aren't used for one bespoke task, but can actually be deployed for a large variety of tasks. And in a way, also amplify these biases. Now, the problem with the initial draft we've seen for the AI Act, as Kim already explained, is that it builds around the notion of what an AI system will be used for and its intended purpose. And if an AI model doesn't have one specific intended purpose, but a large variety of different purposes for which it can be used, it doesn't really neatly fit into the framework that the Commission put forward. So what everyone's trying to do now is to sort of like take these square shapes and jam them into the round hole of the AI Act. And we need to come up with a way of actually doing this better and sort of like adapting the framework of the AI Act to account for these models. Because I think there's a lot of reasons to be skeptical of what these models can do and what limitations they have. But the fact is that we've seen a lot of progress recently. We see a lot of funding go towards developing these models. Stability AI, which is behind Stable Diffusion, this image generator, just raised a huge funding round. Microsoft is probably investing more in OpenAI, which develops DALL-E and GPT-3. And we're also increasingly seeing these models deployed in consumer products. So, for example, if you use Notion, which is a sort of note-taking and organizing app, they're now using GPT-3 for sentence completion in much the same way as Gmail or Google Docs does. And Microsoft is trying to incorporate DALL-E into PowerPoint. So if you're working on your slides for your next presentation, you can generate these images to go along with your slides. So I think with all that being said, I think that is like quite a list of reasons for why we need to make sure that these are somehow accounted for in the AI Act, which they currently aren't at this point.
Is there something particularly lacking you find, or anything you would really want to see?
I think the first thing that's really critical to say here is that just because they don't fit into the framework of the AI Act, we shouldn't accept that general purpose AI models should adhere to a lesser standard of protection than other high-risk AI models. And to ensure that, I think we need to make sure that all the requirements that the AI Act imposes on high-risk AI systems need to be met, even if the supply chain is a bit more complex. So we kind of need to come up with a model that's not as binary as the one we currently have, where either one actor has to comply with everything or the other actor, and kind of divide up responsibilities to make sure that whoever is best placed to comply, for example, with data governance requirements or risk management requirements actually meets those requirements. And then another issue that I think is very important is the question of open source AI, because with the proposal we've seen from the European Council, so the member states, they've kind of added the question of open source AI to the mix here. And I think we need to make sure that the final text accounts for the different nature of open source AI and the benefits that it can bring, both in terms of sort of like enabling innovation, but also enabling research on these models and the risks and the security implications and what we can do to make these models safer. So I think we also need to find a workable model of addressing this question as well.
Thanks. Now, Irene, you work at Hugging Face, and Hugging Face is a startup that both has its own model, has its large language model called Bloom, which anyone can access for free. But you guys also host a lot of open source models on your platform. And recently you got into quite a bit of a scandal when a really toxic model was on your platform, and there were a lot of questions around, what's your role? What's your responsibility? Could you talk a bit about the things you do to make these models make your platform safe, and whether you think the AI Act could actually help you, or would it address or help your challenges?
Oof, there's something this field is not. It is not boring for sure. What a joy to be with this incredible group. And hello from New Orleans. I'm at NeurIPS, one of the biggest AI conferences in the world. So, like Melissa said, Hugging Face is working to democratize good machine learning, and we empower open source and open science, but open source is not without controls. So for example, we do have to work on safety controls, such as a safety filter on Stable Diffusion, one of the most popular models for image generation today. Turns out people on the internet like to generate messed up, weird things, and there needs to be technical tooling on our side to make sure we can do the best to empower community research, but be safe about it. We've been working internally on toolings for safety, but also to ease accessibility. A theme that you'll hear generally in my life is just to empower the social sciences and folks who don't necessarily have the computer science skills, but have these incredible perspectives on how to make models safer across different axes. So my main 4 points, I have a lot that I will happily word vomit, but 4 points that I really want to dig home about the EU AI Act is: one, regulation good, especially coming from industry perspective. Innovation just needs to be guided in the right direction without being too prescriptive, but this field has been underregulated for far too long. Second, especially coming from an open source perspective, we need to avoid concentration of power and not just enable high resource organizations, especially big tech, to be able to build and leverage these kinds of what we call general purpose systems. Third, we need to be technically informed, but again, not prescriptive for safety. So for folks in the bias world, we're familiar with there's no such thing as a system that is unbiased. What does it mean to technically mitigate bias, and what is actually implementable from that perspective? And fourth, and I'd love to hear folks' perspectives here. Again, I'm sitting in the US, and as a multicultural person with many minority backgrounds, I want to be really cautious about understanding this Brussels effect and understanding how this regulation is going to influence the world for a topic without borders. What is considered right? What is considered fair for different demographics?
Super, thank you. I want to talk a bit about what you guys have alluded to, like what happens when things go wrong? Who should be held accountable? And because the AI Act, as we all know, kind of addresses it in a weird way. Kim, you're laughing. Tell me a bit. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, right? The product safety model I was talking about before. In a product safety model, you try to mitigate risks, and here we are actually trying to protect fundamental rights with the product safety model. It's like, when talking about like putting a square peg in a round hole, that's one of them as well. So I think what is super important when we're talking about liability or just responsibility in general, what we as Greens are really pushing for is to not only look at whether the system was made well, whether the right data was used, but look at the complete value chain of the AI system. And in that way, also make sure that the person who didn't comply to the law will be liable. I think this is also one of the biggest issues that arise when we're discussing about more general purpose AI, that we see that there's a lot of bigger companies. I mean, Google's Android software, for example, which is also open source. How do we deal with that? And for me, I think what is crucial is that we really look at the value chain. So making sure the data is right, making sure the probes that were put into the system were correct. Then making sure that also when we have the system and it's complied to everything, then we look at what it is used for. And if it is used in a way that will harm fundamental rights, we cannot use it. That's why we want to have a fundamental rights impact assessment before it is being used. And then if you would look at it from all those perspectives and really make sure that along that value chain, we keep track of who's in charge. Then that's also the way we can deal with liability. And I think it is super crucial that we look at all those points and not exempt one of them. So also not the user, the end user, because what is crucial is, first of all, that we create security for everyone in the value chain. But secondly, that we will never have someone whose fundamental rights have been breached that stands empty-handed in front of a computer. And then the only answer we have is like, yeah, system says you are, I don't know, a fraudster. It's a very important example we had from the Netherlands, where a lot of people of color and people with lower incomes were automatically detected as fraudsters by a harmful tax agency system. They should have had a check at least for when it was used. It was a perfect system, but it was used in a way that harmed fundamental rights. So what is extremely crucial for us is that we really look at this full value chain of artificial intelligence and look throughout the whole life cycle, making sure that we comply with the rules and make sure no one's ever left empty-handed.
Irene, how does this sound to you? Like, how realistic is this to operationalize from a company perspective?
That was my question. That is the dream. I would love for that to happen. And what I really want to work on is how to make this technically feasible. I strongly agree with especially these impact assessments. And I've been trying to build them myself. My expertise is in generative modeling, so that's usually what I'm going to lean on here. This varies vastly, even within generative models across modalities. The way that I would look into a language model that generates text for even on one slice of human rights, let's just say racial bias, not even looking into colorism, that is its own field in and of itself. It requires so much thought, expertise across different fields. And then once you try to extrapolate that, for example, to new modalities like text to image, like Stable Diffusion, you're going to have a whole new set of issues of how to create this kind of tooling. So what should that look like in terms of actually building these assessments?
Great. Max, what do you think? Do you have any comments on what Irene or Kim said? And, I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on what this liability and enforcement would look like.
Yeah, I think those were a lot of great points that Kim and Irene made there. And I think sort of to use an example of like how this would look like across the value chain of AI. For example, the AI Act imposes data governance requirements on organizations that are developing and deploying or adapting AI systems. But the thing is also that AI systems can be trained at different stages throughout their life cycle, right? So there's sort of like a pre-training of an AI model that happens with the original developer of the model. But then further downstream, these models can also be fine-tuned to like a more specific use case with a more context-specific data set. And now if you come up with an enforcement model or like a compliance model, where only one of those actors has to comply with all data governance requirements, that simply won't work if they don't have access to the data that's been used by others. So that might be a case where actually two actors might have to comply. And that just goes to show how complex the value chain or supply chain can actually be, and how it might not work with the original proposal for the AI Act. So I think we have to come up with a framework that accounts for these nuances. That's one thing. I think the other thing is that we just need to come up with ways for people also to take action, where sort of like the preventative approach of the AI Act doesn't work out, and people are actually harmed in a way. And what we need is for people to be able to file complaints, which under the original proposal of the AI Act, they couldn't. We need a liability scheme that works for people, and that doesn't excessively like overburden people who have been harmed and then want to file their case and just are faced with so many obstacles that they can't. And there's a whole separate AI liability proposal out there that people in the EU are now starting to work on. So that will also warrant some attention. And then finally, we just need regulators that are also up to the task of enforcing the AI Act. And that requires expertise, that requires people power, that requires a whole lot of things. And I'm really hoping that when this is all wrapped up and passed, that we actually have all those things to make sure that even when the sort of like preventative nature of the AI Act that doesn't really pan out, and the way things go, it probably won't all the time. We have mechanisms to sort of rectify the harms and injustices that have been caused.
Kim, you've talked about the need for maybe having an AI office or kind of like some sort of regulator. How do you see that working? Because this topic is so confusing. Because on one hand, you have artists who have a real problem with copyright, like legitimate concerns about copyright. And then you have women who have non-consensual porn made out of them. And then you have, like in the Dutch case, algorithms that discriminate against minorities. It's just never ending. So how would this, like, how can the EU actually do anything about this?
Yeah, this is still very much up for discussion. But what we did as Greens and what I did with my team is basically look at, okay, what kind of enforcement mechanisms do we have in place right now? Can we learn something from them? Well, first thing that might come to mind is the data protection regulation. And I think we can all wholeheartedly agree that having a system where in practice one member state is in charge of enforcement doesn't work. So that's a no-go for us. And then, of course, last year we had Frances Haugen in the European Parliament, the Facebook whistleblower. And she was very, very clear on the fact that there's actually not that many people in the world who understand the most complex AI systems, the ones that we would need to enforce on a European level. And that's why we as Greens really put forward this idea of having an AI agency, or actually preferably even a digital agency that can also look at, not only at the AI Act, but also perhaps at other digital spheres and other digital acts, where we have the experts in place on all these different issues. And which is then also a resource, because I think, not everything has to be done on a European level. There might be cases that can be done on a national level. It's also more accessible for people, of course, if they can go somewhere in their own member state to when they have a complaint or something has happened to them. But that we have all those experts at least on a European level, and that there are a pooled resource for member states to ask for help when it comes to enforcement. So yeah, that is the way we would like to see it. The agency word is already a very contentious topic in Brussels. Having another agency, no way. At least we are striving for centralized enforcement combined with some national enforcement where necessary. But for bigger cases or cases that could have implications for the whole of the EU, we should have a centralized enforcement system. And I really hope indeed that we can have something that is something of an agency, because we need the experts to do proper enforcement. And just some people who might have studied some very, very important and smart policy and law, but don't really understand how algorithms work, might not cut the chase in this case.
Thank you. Just to pick up on that, I think that kind of illustrates really well the knowledge gap, but also the kind of power imbalance we have right now in AI policy, where certain actors, big companies who can offer very generous pay packages, they have all the, well, not all, but a lot of the talent and a lot of the brain, and they have their own interests. Max, who stands to benefit from general purpose AI being heavily regulated?
I mean, heavily regulated doesn't kind of apply like the direction in which it would be regulated. But what I will say is that sort of if we leave the AI Act as is, or create sort of like a carve out for general purpose AI systems, who would most likely benefit are these very resource rich and powerful companies and larger AI labs. I think everyone knows what I'm talking about here, that are also offering sort of like on their cloud services a lot of sort of AI models that might qualify as general purpose AI under the definitions we currently have, and that are already widely deployed and commercially successful services. So I think that's something worth considering as well. So I think by sort of placing most of the burden on downstream actors, which oftentimes tend to be smaller companies, startups, that would favor these bigger companies. And I think that's something we need to address, because obviously, sort of like the more technically difficult compliance gets, the better placed bigger actors also often are to comply. So I think that's something we need to be cognizant of. And I think that also ties back to the open source issue, because obviously, one thing you accomplish by incentivizing open sourcing AI models is that you sort of like decentralize power in a way, and make the sort of like the advances you have in science and research and development more widely accessible, and allow people to build on this. And if we sort of incentivize like an ecosystem where most of these large models are gated behind sort of like APIs and like walled up by big companies developing them, that leads to very different outcomes. And we just need to think about like what we want in the end, and what's most beneficial to everyone.
I mean, you worked in a couple of startups, well, including OpenAI, which I don't know if you can call a small startup these days, but what do you think? What would startups need to, be able to do innovation and, stand up to tech companies?
What I need is more sleep. That's the startup world, but I am so grateful that Max is also talking about the less glamorous work like data work, the reasons why we need to avoid concentration of power, not just because monopolies equal bad, but also because when you have many perspectives on a system, you make it work better for the multiple people, groups of people that it's affecting. So I used to work at OpenAI, where I started the social impact and fairness research there. And I think that there are some companies that will remain unnamed that do not open their systems at all to any researchers. And then you're just not getting that insight. You're not enabling even downstream actors to do the necessary, for example, data work, and actually peek in and see what's happening. And then going back to my earlier point about what technical tooling exists, there's not a lot in how to sift through these enormous training data sets. So for context, Bloom, which was created by Big Science, an incredible community research effort that Hugging Face hosted of over 1,000 researchers worldwide, created this model that was trained on about 1 terabytes of data, which is huge, enormous. I don't know how to sift through that amount of data, how to pull out artists' work and determine intellectual property. How do you determine what is image-based sexual abuse in 1 terabytes of data? Even though this was text, how do you do that in this large swath of data? Just for context, GPT-3 was 43 terabytes of data. How do you even begin to sift through that as well? So there's just a lot that I think the whole field needs to invest in on the social impact side, on the data work side, that maybe big tech companies have more money, but no one company has all the expertise and perspectives that it needs to robustly evaluate a single model.
Great, thank you. I also wanted to ask you a question about the Brussels effect. You're in New Orleans at NeurIPS, which is one of the world's biggest AI conferences. I'm sure you've met a lot of policy folks there. What's the vibe amongst like the tech crowd, like to the AI Act? How do people see it? Do people see it as a good thing, bad thing? Are people scared, happy? Any vibes?
I am on day 2, so I might have to let you know more about that later. But I mean, generally, maybe this is a social, just how I select people I'm around. I haven't heard any pushback against regulation generally. I mean, AI as a field, as I said, has been historically underregulated. And I think this also depends on where it's such a huge conference and it's such a huge field. I tend to be more in the ethics side, where we start to think more about where are these systems being developed, usually in the Western world, usually by developers who come from the Western world. And what does this mean for the kinds of values that we're embedding in the system that we might be imposing on the rest of the world as these systems are deployed? Similarly to what could be considered these regulatory effects.
Super. Thank you. Now I'd like to remind the audience, like, if you have any questions, now is a great chance to ask them. We have a great panel. So to round this off, I'd like to ask all of you, if you had, Christmas is coming, and if you all had one wish, what would you want the AI Act to have? Kim, let's start with you.
Yeah, I don't know if it's smart to narrow my wishes down to one wish now during the negotiations. No, but I think this fundamental rights impact assessment is super close to my heart, because as long as we don't give any responsibility to the people using AI, we are really missing out on a very big part of risk mitigation when AI is being used. So for me, the fundamental rights impact assessment is really, really crucial.
Super. Max, what's your wish for Santa?
It's a difficult question. One wish I might have would be to come up with a term other than general purpose AI for what we're discussing here, because it causes confusion, because then people think of like artificial general intelligence and sort of like super intelligence. But I think that'd be sort of like giving away a good wish if I used it on that. So I think overall, maybe an AI Act that builds on sort of enables systemic transparency, enables people to take action and seek redress where they're harmed, and that includes inclusive mechanisms for future-proofing the framework when it comes to accounting for risks, when it comes to updating sort of certain provisions in the AI Act, and to sort of like consult with civil society, but also with affected people, because they're the ones who matter in the end.
Great, thank you. And Irene, what's your wish?
I'm assuming we can't wish for more wishes if that holds true. Okay, so, and also since I'm Muslim, I'm going to make this an Eid wish, and we have a little bit more time to make it happen instead of Christmas. So I would say just to invest more in the kinds of infrastructure that smaller organizations need to do this kind of social impact work. And coming from the US, I'm really excited about the National AI Research Resource. So just more from the EU to provide cloud computing credits to provide that infrastructure.
Super. Well, no pressure, EU. That's a lot on, you have a lot on your plate. Thank you so much to the panelists and to the audience. It was a real pleasure, and yeah, thank you. Keep up the good work.